Okay. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay. All right, it's Friday. Yay. Not that I don't love my job. But I'm also not sad that it's Friday. Okay, so. All right. I was getting worried. No, I'm kidding. Midterm average, I'm not quite done. I've got 7 left. So if you haven't gotten your grade, that's because you're in that unlucky 7. The average is sitting right, it's kind of fluctuating as I mark things between like high 39, so 39, almost 40, and just a bit above 40 out of 50. So right around the 79, 80% range. So all good. Okay, so that was the average. I am feeling better. Hopefully, we'll see how long that lasts. My kids are on spring break next week, which should be great for me. Terrible for my wife, but great for me. Okay, let us go and get started here. Oh, my shoe's untied. Oh well, we'll deal with that later. Okay, so we were talking last time about some of our mental health concerns with young people in general. We talked about this study that came out of Springtide Research Institute that looked at young people and concluded that a lot of them are very, very lonely, stressed out, and experiencing a lot of anxiety. And I think made a reasonable link between sort of isolation, in particular, the lack of kind of adult role models, and some of these, stress conditions, right? And again, I mean, maybe I'll go. I'll be fine. I can always do something. If I fall, I fall. My time has come. We saw the difference, right, between our kind of markers of kind of negative mental health and how prevalent they are amongst young people with very few caring adults, or trusted adults, they have it here, trusted adults, and those with a lot, and, generally improving kind of mental health the more trusted adults a young person has in their life. Okay, so I'll say, and again, I don't want to overstress this because I've probably talked about it enough, but I think it's worth saying again, this links, I think, really strongly back to what we saw in the unit on religion, right? When we talk about, what makes those very religious youth in the National Study of Youth and Religion different from the other youth in the sample, a lot of it is the quality of their adult connections and how much there is of it, right? And how institutionally bound they are compared to other groups, right? I don't think it's for nothing, and I don't think he was pointing at this, but we've got our categories of the engaged and the disengaged in the National Study of Youth and Religion data, right? So as we kind of move forward, we see that, that kind of trend continuing with Gen Z. Again, the data from Springtide is a little bit less robust, but I think it still shows that same general trend. And I'll say, just for kind of the record, that it's not like, the need for trusted adults ends at 18, right? As people are going through those emerging adult years, they're moving through a period of a lot of change, right? They're moving out, they're learning how to pay bills. They continue to need a lot of mentorship. So the benefits, though we don't have a lot of data on it, of having these kind of broad social networks, especially of older adults who can kind of, walk you through what life is going to be like and help you out when things get tough. We would expect that those things are going to continue well through that, emerging adult period, right, as they go, towards their 30s, and into, developing those more serious romantic relationships, having children and all that. Those things all have a ton of benefits. And increasingly, it's something that, as, Netflix and, Netflix. Jeez, I'm having a Friday. I'm going to erase that and try that again. Netflix, right? Netflix, and I don't want to just blame Netflix, even though it is all their fault. Netflix and phones are isolating people more. They get less of that high quality connection. Okay, so from the merely depressing to the extraordinarily depressing we go, because we're going to look at some pretty specific mental health claims, and we're gonna kind of like follow the data along, because the thing that I sort of want to get at is we've had a really kind of Canada, but probably more American, right, USA kind of focus through a good part of the course. A big part of that is because the American social science data is so robust, right? We have so much data when it comes to the United States because they have all these longitudinal studies and a crazy publishing industry and a crazy college system that generates a lot of social science data, which we just don't in Canada. But we're going to look specifically at how this is happening, in the US and Canada. We want to look a little bit at what's happening in some other places as well to just sort of establish, I guess, whether this is a problem that's kind of local and specific or whether it is broader. Okay, so we're going to start in the US, as we always must, I suppose. USA, right? And this is data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is again a longitudinal study that's been conducted by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. This time, Georgia the state, not the country. And basically, this is data. This is a survey that kind of looks at risk behaviors for young people, and here we have about a 10-year kind of period of data. Okay, so what does this look like for American youth? So, experiencing persistent feelings of sadness. I'm sadly that I said that. Sadness or hopelessness. So back, it kind of held pretty steady here. And this is kind of interesting, right? We see, 2011, 2013, 2015, 2017, we're hanging, it rose a little bit, but it's hanging around, the 30% range. So we can easily put this down to things like margin of error, right, in terms of the research tool. It jumps in 2019, which I think is important again, because we're talking pre-COVID, right, before any of us knew COVID was coming. And then I think not surprisingly, rose in 2021, rather considerably. So we see a pretty marked spread between those two numbers, right? And this is a bad. The red stop sign is a bad trend. Asked if they experience poor mental health. This is a new question, so we have no data until the 2021 sample. So as this continues to come out, and I should go see if I can find the 2023 numbers, it was 29% of kind of the youth surveyed said they were experiencing poor mental health, right? So not quite a third, but still considerable. Seriously considered attempting suicide, right? Again, it kind of bounces around, somewhere around 17%. And then we see a little bit of a jump, as we head into the early 2020s. That could still, 6% is usually beyond margin of error. So we probably are seeing there a kind of slow increase rather than, a statistical tool. Same thing with made a suicide plan, right? It kind of hovers around 14% and it rises a little bit more in these samples. Still probably margin of error, like high in kind of margin of error, but still thinkable. Suicide attempts really kind of bounce around at 9, 10, around 9%. So not a big increase there. And same thing with injuries. They have it as a stop sign because that last number went up to 10. But I would still say, not a huge increase. And then were injured, in a suicide attempt that had to be treated by a doctor or nurse, right? Not a big one. It's kind of held pretty steady. Okay. So this is kind of the similar numbers, right? Again, from the CDC, but visualized a different way and split by gender, right? Or by sex, rather. So percentage of female and male students experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, 2011 to 2021. And what we see, right, I think what's notable, increased for both, but, where you're seeing an 8% increase amongst males, you're seeing, a 21% increase for females. So whatever the cause is here, and there's obviously, I think we can say this is overdetermined. There's going to be a lot of overlapping causes to something like this. It affects our female part of the population considerably more than it does the male part of the population, because we're seeing a much bigger kind of impact effect, right? You're seeing a much greater, it's causing a much greater change for females. Okay, same thing, seriously considering a suicide attempt, right? And again, what you see for our female part of the cohort, you are seeing what, an 11% change versus just a 1% change for males, right? So that's a big change, right? That's definitely beyond any kind of margin of error, right? We're now talking, a pretty strong effect, especially for females. Males seem to have remained roughly the same, right? 1% change, and it's kind of bounced around 13, 14% the whole time. So males seem about as likely as they were in 2011 to seriously consider attempting suicide. Females much more likely to do so. Okay. Oh, I haven't tripped yet. Hang on. There we go. All right. So one of the possible reasons, and this is all data that was put together by Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge and their grad student at the time, he's got a PhD now, Zach Rausch. Right? They put all of this together and published it. So that helpfully with all the charts so that I could steal them, which I really, really like. I love stealing. It's the best. So what do we have here? Now, the contention that they're going to make, and I think, again, we can kind of see this in what we were talking about last class and what I've been kind of trying to get at, through the religion unit as well, is this probably is all related in some way to loneliness, right? To social isolation and changes in behavioral patterns caused by technology, right? By technology. And what kinds of technologies specifically would we be thinking about? Again, I think entertainment, social media, and phones generally. I'll tell you why Jonathan Haidt is the least popular person in my home for my 2 teenage children later as we get to it. Okay, but my daughter blames him for many things that she feels have gone wrong in her life just recently in the last year. Okay, so what do we see? Time spent with friends. So for everybody, it's down, right? Like if we look at the numbers, back in 2003, they're a little bit higher than they are today. Or I guess this ends in 2021. they've definitely kind of moved around, over time. At certain periods, people have spent, and this is all categorized by ages, right? So people have spent more or less time with friends on a daily basis. But what seems, obviously, I think the biggest change is for our youngest part of the cohort. And again, this is going to be our Gen Z part of the cohort. By the time we get down here, right? Sorry, let me erase a little bit. I erased everything. My bad. Okay. I'm not going to redraw it all. So when we're talking here, right? So 2003 to, into here, these are your millennials. Once you get kind of past about here, then you're starting to talk Gen Z. Okay? So, what's the big difference? The obvious big difference is in 2003, right, your cohort of, what's the ages here? 15 to 24. We're spending, on average, about a little bit over 2 hours, right? 2 hours and 40 minutes. I guess almost 3 hours a day with friends. So that's a lot, right? 2 hours, 40 minutes with friends per day. Now, I remember this time, right? So 2003, oddly, was the year I met my wife. 2005 is the year I graduated from my undergrad degree. So I remember this, and I do remember spending a lot of time with friends. But oh me, I'm such a social butterfly. So that's just how I go, I guess. What you see, right, is a pretty substantial drop. It drops below 2 hours, in the kind of 2008, 2009 kind of range, and then bumps back up, and then, drops again, and then takes a really severe drop here. And then we can almost just kind of like forget about this part because that's COVID, and that's going to be a really hard thing to kind of deal with. But already before we got to COVID, right, the time people were spending with their friends daily was dropping pretty substantially, right? So that by the time, you get just before COVID, which would be about here, you're already spending, so they're down to about 60 minutes. They're essentially spending 100 fewer minutes with friends a day. Okay? So a pretty, not quite, not exactly, but pretty close, right, to 100 fewer minutes a day with their friends. Now, everybody is spending less time together, right, with friends, through here. It's been dropping for a while. So it's a universal effect. It's just that the amount of it is happening much more amongst our youngest part of the cohort, right? Which, frankly, these people weren't spending all that much time with friends to begin with, and they spend a little bit less. These folks were spending a ton of time with their friends, and now they're spending a lot less time with friends. Okay, one more erasure, because I want to point something out here, which you'll see on a bunch of these slides. There's a big black line on 2012, right? Which, again, because we're talking about Twenge particularly, but Jonathan is a friend of hers, right? They've worked together lots, and they have similar sorts of research interests, and they ask similar sorts of questions. 2012 is a very particular mark for them. And why? So if you recall from the beginning of the course, we talked about this when we talked about iGen. That's the year that 50% of Americans, smartphone ownership crossed the 50% threshold. For teenagers, it was 75%. For emerging adults, I believe it was about 98%, right? So that is, it's the year that 50% threshold is crossed. And, for our younger cohorts, it's even more than that, right? Because probably, grandma and grandpa were a little bit slow on smartphone adoption, even by 2012. And so they were dragging down the average. But even by then, right, you're starting to get the majority of the population using smartphones daily. Or using smartphones, owning smartphones. Okay. So again, you'll see that same line on all of these because they're rhetorically quite consistent. So, markers of mental illness, and what Haidt, Twenge, and Rausch basically suggest is that the serious markers of mental illness are increasing. More teens are reporting depression and other diagnosed mental illnesses. Now, they say the speed of the growth likely means that it's not simply a matter of reporting. Because this is one of the things that I guess they do have their opponents, right? Like no data is ever rock solid. There's always people that debate everything. And people have criticized Twenge and Haidt particularly for catastrophism. Frankly, and I actually don't think it's true because, how to put it? People have accused both Haidt and Twenge of sensationalism, right? Why? Well, because sensationalism sells a lot of books. And to be fair, right, both of these people have done really, really well in the publishing market. Jean Twenge's book, iGen, was a bestseller, right? So it was read by a lot of people. That's nothing in terms of money. And Jonathan Haidt's recent book, The Anxious Generation, which we'll talk about in a spell, also a bestseller. So it's really kind of polarized people. And people have said, well, you're telling a story of catastrophe because catastrophe sells better than, everything is basically okay. Now, I've read a lot of the literature. I don't agree with that assessment of either of them. I think they're much more well-intentioned than that. And frankly, like Jonathan in particular, gives away a lot of his stuff on Substack for free. So I think he's just actually more concerned with young people in general. But the criticism has been, right, well, Gen Z is just more attuned to mental health, so they're reporting kind of mental health problems at a higher rate, right? They're much more likely to say that they have mental health problems and get help. Now, and they've done some regression analyses on this, where Haidt and Twenge will say, no, that doesn't match up with what we're seeing. But either way, I don't think that criticism is warranted. I think the data does back up what they're saying. But I just want you to know there's certainly some dispute about this data. And there's always going to be disputes. Okay, so what do we see? The prevalence of anxiety, right? So what we kind of see, right, that younger part of the cohort was always a little bit more anxious than older parts of the cohort, right? That's pretty normal. 26 to 34-year-olds were a little bit less anxious at the start of this than our 35 to 49-year-olds. And our most chilled out part of the cohort in terms of anxiety is our age 50 plus. Like, man, what do they have to worry about? I'm sure lots, but anxiety not super prevalent. Okay, and it kind of bounces around. It stays pretty flat. Like our younger part of the cohort, in 26 to 34, swaps places with the 35 to 49-year-olds. But then again, we hit 2012, and we start to see, the spike, and it goes from sub 10%, right? Where are we here? About 7%, to about 15% of our youngest part of our cohort reporting anxiety, right? And the same thing for that second oldest part of the cohort, right? They jump from, a little over 5, maybe 6%, up almost to 10%. We're going to say 9. So big increases. And they put on the kind of increase factors, which I think is kind of useful, right? So there's a 92% increase since 2010 for our age 18 to 25, 62% for 26 to 34, 18% for 35 to 49, and 7% for this part, right? For the oldest part. So it's still an increase, just not a very big one. Okay, so we're seeing, this is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health in the US. God, I love American data. So much of it. Okay, this one from the National College Assessment, right? This is US undergraduates diagnosed with a mental illness, right? So again, what we saw was about 10% of them in 2008 diagnosed with either anxiety or depression, and both of those jump up substantially, 134 and 106%. ADHD jumps up, right, pretty considerably. I don't know if this is better diagnosis or, some people have made the claim that like smartphones are fragmenting our attention so much that it's sort of like tech-induced ADHD. I actually don't know how to parse that claim because I'm not a psychologist, but we definitely see a bit of an increase. And the rest, right, bipolar, anxiety, or anorexia, substance abuse, they go up a bit, but they're pretty low still, right? It's a 57%, 100%, 33%, and 67% increase, but they still remain relatively low. The big growth is obviously anxiety and depression, right? So something seems to be driving runaway growth in anxiety and depression. Okay. There are too many charts on this page. There are too many charts on this page. They are too small for me to read on my screen. Okay. So we see lots of things happening, right? So, and again, we have our patterns separated by sex here, right? So what do we see? Can I make my, teens admitted for non-fatal self-harm, right? And again, this is from CDC data. So 15 to 19-year-olds, and we have our 10 to 14-year-olds, right? So this is a very young part of the cohort here. Okay, so for 15 to 19-year-olds, 48% increase in the number of self-harms. And this is what, rate per 100,000. So you're up, in the like 700-ish self-harm, hospitalizations for self-harm per 100,000. So that's a big increase, right? 48%, 37% for boys. The boys, again, much smaller than for girls. Girls, 188% growth in terms of this youngest cohort growth, 48%, 48% for boys. Okay, suicides. Now, boys have always had a higher suicide rate than girls have, right? This is pretty consistent. One of the reasons is typically down to the method of suicide that boys and girls select. Girls are much more likely to attempt to poison themselves, typically using medication, and boys are much more likely to use a gun, right? And again, this is US data, so guns are more abundant than civil rights, I think. Sorry, terrible joke about guns. There's more guns in America than people for some reason. I don't know why. It just is the way it is, right? Okay, so still pretty meaningful kind of growth, right? Suicides per 100,000 of the US population, right? Boys kind of spike up and then come down a little bit, but we see natural variations. It's up 34%. Now girls, again, fewer suicides, but the increase of the rate is higher, about 82%. And then this one, right, we're talking our 10 to 14-year-olds, which, it's not a lot, right? You got 2 per 100,000 was where it started, but it's trending up towards 4 per 100,000. So it's a lot of really young people still committing suicide, right? And for girls, right, it's spiking again. Now we've gone from less than 1 per 100,000 to above, or right around 2 per 100,000. So still a pretty substantial increase at the end of the day. But again, it has kind of gendered patterns where boys do commit suicide more, again, down to the method they use. I'm just checking where I'm at. I have many charts remaining. Perfect. I dropped my pen. All right, well, while I'm down here, I'm going to tie my shoe, give everyone a chance to catch their breath. Did not do that on purpose. Okay. So again, we don't have especially robust data in Canada compared to the US, right? Unfortunately, Canada just is. I'm going to keep saying this. I will one day attempt to fix this because we're trying to work on a project. Me and a a colleague of mine to do some of this kind of research in Edmonton to start, and then hopefully expanding to Alberta and then Canada and then the world. No, just Alberta and then Canada, but it's a slow go. But all right, so what do we see? Emergency department visits, and this is for self-harm, right? So this is self-harm in Ontario for ages 13 to 17. We see a similar kind of trend, right? Girls are up 138%, per 100,000. Boys are up 75%. So increases in both. Again, for self-harm, we're seeing a lot more in girls than we are in boys. This is what I do like. So this is from the Canadian Community Health Survey, and the data is decently long, 2003 to 2019. And they asked, people to rate who rated their mental health as excellent or very good for Canadian women. And what we see is that at the beginning, right, in 2003, the most likely cohort to say that they had excellent or very good mental health was actually the youngest part of the sample, the 15 to 30-year-olds, right? So really, our teenagers and emerging adults. And by the end, right, by 2019, so again, pre-COVID, they were the least likely. Why did half my circle disappear? Okay, and they'd seen a huge drop off, right? So they went from most likely to say that they had good or excellent mental health, right, at let's say about 75%, to below 60%, and trending. If this trend line continues, they're going to bottom through 50%. So less than half of 15 to 30-year-old Canadian women are going to say they have excellent or very good mental health. We saw changes for other cohorts, but right, our 47 plus only saw a 2% decline, and 31 to 46, an 11% decline, right? So declines, but much more modest. All right, for men, the effects aren't quite, it's the same pattern, but without as big of a factor, right? So for our youngest part of the cohort, it's a 15% decline. They went from, again, about 75, 76%, down to, where did they end up? I gotta stop walking around, changing my perspective. Let's say about 66% there. But again, our 47-year-olds plus saw the least decline, and our 31 to 46-year-olds, the decline is only 8%, so it's pretty modest as well. So our younger Canadians are expressing significant declines in mental health, both male and female, but again, for females, it's considerably worse than it is for males. It's not great for males, but it's definitely there. And it manifests in things like hospitalizations for mental health related conditions, more self-harm, all of these sorts of things. Okay. Yeah, I think the rate is actually relative, if I recall, and I could be wrong on this. The rate is actually not as different. Boys do attempt suicide slightly more often, but they are much, much more successful, which is not a good thing, obviously. So boys are more successful, and again, it goes down to the method they use. Now, American numbers are also double skewed because American numbers, like in Canada, the difference is still there. It's not as large because there aren't as many guns. Guns are the secret sauce of, sorry, that's a glib metaphor, which I shouldn't use when you're talking about that. But they are sort of the secret sauce of successful suicide attempts in the US, right? And there are just so many guns, and they're so easy to come by that it increases the rate. I mean, we saw this a little bit at the beginning of the course too when we looked at Generation X, right? Gen X had a big spike in taking their own lives, specifically because there was a weird loosening of gun laws in the 1980s. When they tightened gun laws up a little bit, it seems to have sort of slowed that down. But again, there's so many guns in the US, it just makes suicide considerably easier, which again, not a good thing. Okay. Again, now we got UK data, right? So out of the UK, I was going to make a joke about it's probably because of all the bad food in the UK, but it's a terrible joke and I shouldn't make it. The food is really bad though. Okay, so happiness trends. Again, what do we see? And these are our 10 to 15-year-olds in the UK. So again, we're limited sometimes by the data that's publicly available, but pretty solidly, right? Satisfied with life as a whole. And what does this come from? The Good Child Report from the Understanding Society survey of adolescent mental disorders since 2010. Okay, so kind of boys and girls, right? They've got an average kind of happiness score out of 10 of about 8.2 back in 2009. And, you know, boys kind of bump along a little bit until right about here, about 2013, 2014. And then they drop considerably right down to, you know, 7.8 and then maybe like 7.9, 8%, 4% decline. Girls start the drop sooner, and we see this pretty consistently, right? The drops in girls tend to start a little bit sooner. They're more socially attuned in lots of ways, and the drop is substantially greater, right? Girls end up at 7.47%, you know, having started, you know, kind of in the 80s, they're dropping into the 70s. Okay, same thing with anxiety and depression. Again, these are 11 to 15-year-olds in the UK, right? Anxiety for girls rises 61%, for boys 71%, though it started at a lower point. Depression for girls up 138-ish percent, 60% for boys. But again, I guess they kind of started at similar places, and girls have just diverged here significantly. Okay, and then self-harm hospitalizations. Again, different patterns. Boys, you would talk about a slow rise, right? Pretty steady, but slow. And girls, it's, you know, the dreaded hockey stick graph. You know, the hockey stick graph, you know, kind of does that. It looks like the blade of a hockey stick. This is a classic kind of hockey stick style graph, you know, relatively, I mean, still high, about 600 episodes of self-harm per 100,000, but then spikes up, right, at up to like 1250, right? So basically doubles before coming down a little bit, you know, at the kind of tail end of the sample. So this might be an aberration, but it's a considerable kind of increase as well. So similar patterns, similar male-female patterns, right? All right. Oh, and we're going to talk about this. This is going to be fun. I have all sorts of things to say about this. Okay. Like, am I going to run out of slides before the end of class? No, I will not, because that slide in and of itself will take like a good chunk of time. Oh, it's causing so many problems. I have to tell you this. I have other charts that I should bring in. I have more charts. So many more charts, friends. I'm sorry. You all want to look at charts for the rest of your lives, don't you? Okay. Same thing in Australia, right? We see similar patterns, right? This is self-poisoning. Again, so this is generally taking medication of some kind. Same kind of thing, right? That 2012 line, things kind of started to spike in Australia a little bit earlier, but that same sort of pattern, right? We see a big jump in self-poisonings for girls 15 to 19, but a kind of steady rise for everybody else, right? Boys, what's that bottom one? 5 to 14, we didn't see as much of it. But I mean, concerningly, right? 5 to 14-year-old girls in Australia and, you know, are doing self-poisoning at a not zero rate, which I think is definitely something of a concern. And I don't think this counts just walking outside in Australia and being bitten by one of their 500 poisonous animals. You have to actually do it to yourself. Okay. Australia terrifies me. Every time I go on Twitter, there's like some New Zealander or Australian that posts a picture of a spider as big as my face. And I'm like, I don't think I could deal with this. I don't think I had applied for a job at University of Wellington in New Zealand, and I'm really glad I didn't get it. Plus, my daughter is super terrified of spiders, so that would have turned out well. Okay, so same thing with ER visits, right? big jump for our females 12 to 24. Increase still in the 25 plus, and a slight increase for our males 12 to 24. Self-harm hospitalizations, same pattern, right? For Australian females, it's this youngest part of the cohort. The rest of them are pretty steady. The 20 to 24, right, our emerging adult cohort here. A little bit of a jump, but still, not the kind of jump we saw with that bigger thing. Okay. And then psychological distress. Oops, no, stop it. There, my line disappeared again. Again, you see that big jump for females in that, late teen or mid to late teen, early kind of 20s cohort. Similar jumps for males in that 16 to 24, and increases for females 25 plus and males 25 plus, but they start at lower places and they end at lower places, right? So the biggest concern is the orange line, right? Your females 16 to 24. Okay. Oh, let's get controversial, because I've said nothing controversial in this course at all. Okay. One of these days I'm gonna get myself in trouble. But I actually should show you some of these. There's increasing kind of evidence of a massive divergence in male-female kind of political views, like across the board and like between countries, and it's really interesting. But it also is probably making it harder for men and women to get together because they have diametrically opposed views of the world, which doesn't tend to work out. Okay, so what do we see? This is a Pew 2020 survey. Has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you you have a mental health condition? So what do we see? Okay, again, women considerably more likely to be told that they have a mental health condition. This could be down to who seeks help. Men are less likely to do so for lots of reasons. What's interesting in this chart is obviously, conservative women in this 18 to 29 bracket, about 20%. However, when we look at our liberal women in the same bracket, right, it's over 50% who've been told by a healthcare provider that they have a mental health condition. And, for our political moderates, they're somewhere in the middle. Come on, moderates, pick a side. No, I'm kidding. Again, this is from Pew Research data. It's graphed by Jonathan Haidt. This is data from, I think, one of the most fabulous studies ever conducted. This longitudinal study goes back to 1972, called Monitoring the Future. This section only has from 2005 to 2018. But what do we see? Okay, across the board, we see depression scores by gender rising all across the board, right? Everybody is getting more depressed. That is not controversial. However, what we see is your female liberals considerably more depressed than your other groups, right? With male conservatives being the least likely to report depression in this scale, right? But it's gone up, and female conservatives took a big jump in 2014, right? Female liberals took a bigger jump earlier, and they are much higher. Okay, so politics, it seems to play a role. Do I have this? Oh, yes. Okay, I got this on the next slide. Sorry, because I have what I think is the explanation to this. On most measures, those who identify as politically liberal have worse mental health outcomes than those who are politically conservative, right? So the obvious conclusion is that liberalism is bad for your brain. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. There's probably other things going on, and let's talk about that. But I just had to make that joke, right? I had to go Jordan Peterson for a moment and just be like, you shouldn't be a liberal woman. That's the worst thing you could do. What's that? But they sound exactly the same. Anyway, he would definitely say something like this. But anyway, someone has gone into my house. Oh dear. I think it's my son. That's probably better. Okay, they have a short school day today. All right. Oh, Can we do this in 4 minutes? No, we can't. All right, I'm going to pick it up here. There's actually a lot to say here, and I don't want to rush it. So why don't we give you a break from charts until Monday, and we'll go from there. Okay. Have a great weekend.